Okay, so for the second thing, this is number 2 on the list of influential art. And I also wanted to add something that perhaps I'll go back one day and, talk more in depth about the things I've put on this list because really and truly, each thing on this list is something that you can trace for miles and miles and miles. And you can find that's the beautiful thing about following the trail of art is that everything is, people think the big thing these days is sequels and trilogies and prequels, right? Well, you guys, I want to let you know that you can find those things even in things that weren't meant to have sequels or prequels. For instance, from Wilderness, there's a million Wilderness, the book of poems by Jim Morrison that I referenced in the first video, the first part of the series. Now this is video number 2, and in Wilderness, you can trace that to a million things, but never mind that. The second thing I would like to list is I wrote down here Bob Dylan's debut album, of course, Bob Dylan. Now, I've talked about Dylan to death on this channel, so why am I mentioning him again? Well, I'll try to mention him again because I do want to say, and I cannot let this album go. This actually is, admittedly, my favorite Bob Dylan album. I wouldn't want to do away with every other album he's ever done, but really and truly, the first one is my all-time favorite by Dylan, and ironically, he doesn't have one goddamn song of his on it. Now, why do I like this one the best? Well, number one, I think we see Dylan in his hungriest form, and I always like a man when he's starving, because we all spend our lives starving, most of us. So, and most of the world is starving, guys. Let's not forget that. I don't want to joke about that, but the truth is that most of the world is pretty hungry. So, when I find someone pretty hungry in art, I see something that I interpret as being authentic. And that's the thing about a lot of the stuff that the 60s, this is, we're going off we're taking off on another route here, you see, from Dylan's Dylan album. Most of the stuff you find in the modern world is very refined and commercialized, whether we like it or not, whether we want to admit it or not. It's very commercialized, and you won't see a lot of authenticity in it in a way. And versus this Dylan album, which is the authenticity is just dripping right off of it when you listen to it. And I've listened to every song on that album millions of times. What I like about it is, and I didn't find this one until later in life. I probably didn't listen to Dylan's album, Bob Dylan, the debut album, I believe, from 1961. I probably didn't listen to that till really, I've probably only known about it for 6 years now, maybe 7. I heard it probably when I was about 19, 20 years old, and it struck me as such a big deal because it was really and truly the first time I had ever heard, ever, an album with just one guy with one guitar and one harmonica throughout literally the whole album. Now, the albums that Dylan really got big with were, of course, he did get big with Blowing in the Wind. That was the second album I think he put out. I think it was called Blowing. No, Freewheeling Bob Dylan. My bad. Um, he got big with that one. That's true. But for some reason, I just didn't find that one first. I found the first one. You know what I'm saying? And that was really the first like time that I heard just one guy with one acoustic guitar, and man, it sounded strange. And the other thing that was strange about it is, in comparison to Freewheeling Bob Dylan, is that on the first one, he's really flipping out. The songs are really dark. He's covering these old dark blues songs, many of which I've probably passed through on this channel. And I mean, even for this channel, this album was you can see it all over this channel because it's literally like you just walk into a room and he's sitting there, and it's like you're in the Wild West. And that was the other thing I loved about it, was that it's very much a Western atmosphere to this album. It's very much like a 19th century sort of thing that really, it was a mistake it was ever recorded. And in fact, it hardly sold at all for Dylan, from what I've read. It hardly sold at all. It was really almost considered a complete failure. And then he came out with the second one where they said, you know what, Mr. Dylan, maybe what you should do is write your own songs, and then you'll see something. And then, of course, for Freewheeling Bob Dylan, which comes out in 62 or 63, I believe, Dylan writes his own songs for apparently what was the first time or something. And then he strikes it big. Everyone says this guy's talented. We got to listen to this guy. He's the voice of a generation. Yada 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 yada. But it's so fascinating to go back to the first one, because when you listen to that one, you're listening to a guy who has no idea what is about to happen. Yeah, and I always thought that was so cool. I mean, think about what he became. There'll never be another one like him. You know what I'm saying? And you're listening to a guy who has no idea what's about to happen to him. That voice you're hearing, this guy has no idea where he's going to be the next night. He has no idea, but he's about to become Bob Dylan. He's just changed his name from Robert Zimmerman to Bob Dylan. It's crazy. When you listen to the album, the life in the harmonica. I mean, everybody listened to that one, I think, years later and said, Jesus, God, this is great. His voice, everything. I could listen to it a million times. Hands down, in my opinion, not only one of the greatest albums from the 60s generation, but one of the greatest albums in American history as a whole, and certainly one of the most influential albums that I've ever heard. Not only one influential albums, but just one of the most influential pieces of art I've ever heard. And now something else has struck me about why this album is so influential, and part of that reason is because it's really one. I'll try to get to this more in depth in another video, but it's really probably one of the first times we ever hear. Well, not one of the first, but you know, it's kind of significant because they're passing the microphone to a regular fella now, and he's coming up in an era. You have to remember that a lot of albums were recorded that were like this in the 30s, the 20s, the 40s. Robert Johnson, Woody Guthrie, all these people, Lead Belly, they were all recording songs like this, just them and the guitar. But of course, most white people had never heard of that stuff because it was very gritty. And by the time we get into the 40s, what happens is everybody turns on to this big band orchestra thing. A la Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Bing Crosby, and all these guys. And then by the 50s, remember this album comes out in 61, and then by the 50s, we go through a whole other rejuvenation in the music scene where the artist has to be hip, well dressed, very attractive, know how to dance, cute, all this stuff. The lyrics became really infantile in a way. Certainly not something that would be talking about death or poverty or woe or suffering and all this. And instead, that's what he sings about on this first album. So it really was a big deal because he brought something back. Like that thing was kind of dead. Look at it like it was like an animal lying on the side of the road that was dead, and it was called the folk music, and that was what the big deal was. Like we look back now, and he just revived that in one fell sweep. Dylan just revived that. Later on, he abandoned it. Turns out that he really never even kind of liked folk music in a way, from what I've read. He just kind of did it because he thought there was a scene. You know what I'm saying? If you look into the history of this album, it's fascinating. You'll find a whole other world to look through. So that's number 2 on my list of all-time most influential art that has reached me. Is number 2, Bob Dylan's album. Bob Dylan, the debut album, 1961. So the first thing on the list was Jim Morrison's book of poems, Wilderness. And number 2 is Bob Dylan's album, Bob Dylan. So as you can see, the 60s were, even though I wasn't there, were very important for me. Grazie.